And the Lord said, I have given them enough time. Go ahead and disconnect. December 30th, 2025, I had to make the decision to disconnect from my parents. Hey, what's going on YouTube? Michael Renee here, and I feel like I have so many testimonies to share, but today I have a testimony of obedience to the Lord, and my testimony involves having to separate myself completely from my family. And so if you guys would like to hear the story on how we got to this point, continue watching and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you had told me 10 years ago that I was no longer going to be able to communicate with my parents, I was no longer going to be able to communicate with 90% of my siblings, I would have looked at you and I would have thought you were crazy. But if you had told me this 5 years ago, I would have looked at you and probably would have been like, I could see that happening. I knew it was coming, but as much as we try to prepare for something so life-changing, and the Lord has made it very clear just how life-changing it's going to be for your life. The truth of the matter is you can prepare as much as you possibly can, but nothing can prepare you for such a decision to be made, especially when you grew up knowing a certain thing, or you had it in your mind that this was how life was supposed to be. And God was like, not so. And see, the difference between me and probably a few other people is this was not like well, they're dead, so there's nothing that I can do about that. No. I had to make a decision while they are living, that I had to follow God and be obedient to his voice and separate myself. Back in 2023, November 2023, I'll never forget it. The Lord and I were talking, and I was fasting. I was actually doing the Year of the Bride fast. And the Lord told me, he brought me to the book of Genesis, chapter 12. And that is a very prominent scripture verse that God brings me to often, when God told Abraham to leave his father's land and go to a land where he would show him. But that particular day, he told me to read chapter 11 first, like the ending of chapter 11. And that goes into the story of Abraham's father. I can't remember his name, and I'll put it in the comments below, but I'll put it in the little link below, little description below. And how his father was getting ready to step over into the promised land, but he ended up camping right outside of the promised land. As a matter of fact, his name, I can't think of his name right now, but his name actually means delay. And the very next chapter verse, God told him to separate from his family. And God always gave me that verse when it was time for me to move to Atlanta. But I never thought that I thought it was just going to be me moving. I didn't think that it was going to be a decision was going to have to be made as it pertains to me completely letting go of my family. And I remember that same day, the Lord said to me, I'm separating you completely from your family. And I was like, you mean distant cousins? Like, you mean, cousins-in-laws? Like, what exactly are you meaning? And the Lord said, no, I'm separating you from your siblings and your parents. And I remember being in tears, and we weren't in the best place, but I remember being in tears, and I just could not believe that that was going to be an actual thing. Again, this has been a thought. This has been a conversation with the Lord a few times, but I didn't think that it was going to be like that. And so just put a pin in that for a second. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of my backstory growing up, and how we even got to this decision. I was born and raised in church. I'm the oldest of 8 children, by my parents. And before I even start, I want to be clear, this is not a bashing video for my parents. I still honor them, and I will not go into full-blown detail because the Lord made it very clear, I want you to protect them. Although they are not doing the same for me, I'm going to protect my parents, although we are not on speaking terms right now. So yeah, I was born and raised in church. That's all we knew growing up. I knew church. My parents kept us very close-knit, very sheltered. We knew school and home. Had a couple of friends here and there. I think because I was the oldest, I probably experienced the brunt of being closed off and being sheltered as a kid. The rest of my siblings, the younger they got, the younger they go, they got to experience a little bit more than what I got to experience. And so, you know, I saw a lot more and I experienced a lot more than the rest of my siblings. I did not grow up in a home where it was, well, for me, I did not grow up, you know, having to deal with sexual assaults or any type of abuse like that as it pertains to anything like that. But I dealt with a lot as a kid. I dealt with a lot spiritually. My spiritual gifts were, you know, going haywire. I didn't know that God had chose me to break generational curses. I didn't even know anything about generational curses during that particular time. But I want to emphasize the fact that I was born and raised in church. I didn't know anything but church and gospel music. I wasn't until I got into a certain age when I started listening to secular music because that's all we heard in school. And I want to emphasize on that because I remember, because if you guys have watched my video, and I'll put the link down below when I talk about, you know, dealing with spiritual abuse and church hurt, I remember God telling me that spiritual abuse did not start when I was at my old church. He said it started at home. And that's when God began to bring up things that happened in my past. And so we were under the assumption that, you know, being born and raised in church, that it was the typical Black church idea that God was going to bless you if you were faithful, and which was true. You know, God is going to bless you if you're faithful, you pay your tithes, you know, you do right by God, he's going to do right by you. That's what I knew. That's what I knew church and God to be. Don't get me wrong. In the beginning, I came from, for the most part, a praying family. That's what, and it was funny when people would prophesy over me and be like, yo, you know, your parents, they pray, your grandparents, they pray, you know, they were absolutely right. And so, I remember being 7 years old, and I saw all of the girls at my church at the time. I saw all of them get baptized. And I remember thinking to myself, I got baptized for all the wrong reasons, didn't know what I was doing, but I remember saying to myself, I wanted to be baptized so that my parents would be proud of me. I remember saying that to myself. And I remember the pastor that, you know, I told the pastor that I wanted to be baptized, and he pretty much gave me a picture and showed me a pictograph, I guess that you can say, technically, of what I was getting ready to get myself into. Like, he was like, do you want to go to heaven or hell? Heaven's good, hell's bad. And I was like, well, definitely don't want to go to hell. And so I got baptized.
So I was going to tell you guys the dream,
shortly
but
after
I felt the Holy Spirit tell me not to tell the dream. But basically, you guys, God gave me a dream at the age of 7, right after I got baptized, and it was about my parents. Little did I know that the dream was going to manifest itself today, like literally manifest itself today. And it was a dream that scared me to my core. I didn't understand why God was showing me that at the age of 7. But once you guys hear the rest of my testimony, it'll all make sense.
Seven years of age, I didn't understand why God gave me that dream. I just immediately thought that it was a nightmare, and I prayed that dream away. But God gave me that dream consistently. Every night, it was the same dream for about 2 years, like almost every night for 2 years straight. To the point to where I knew that it was something from God, kind of, sort of, to the point where I was like, praying it away. Like, please don't show me this. Like, it got to the point where I couldn't sleep. I couldn't talk to my parents about it. I couldn't tell my parents what was going on because I didn't. I think I might have told them the dream. I honestly don't remember. And my parents would always talk about how we were going to get a brand new house. Like, we had a house when we had a house, but of course with a family of 10, we grew out of it very quickly. And I remember my parents always talking about how God was going to bless us with a new home. And I remember this one particular day, I came home from school. I was in the 6th grade. I came home from school and there was an eviction notice on the door. I'm in the 6th grade. I know what eviction means. And I remember running to my mother and I said, what is this? Are we getting evicted? What's going on? And I remember her looking at me and her saying to me, no, it's fine. Nothing's wrong. A month later, during that time, my dad never picked us up from school. If he did, it was very shocking. He must have had the week off for vacation. I remember that day my dad picked us up from school. And I remember being confused, being concerned, like, is everything okay? Why are you picking us up? And I remember him having a hard time. I knew something was wrong. I was racking my brain, like, do we have a dentist appointment? Do we have a doctor's appointment? What's going on? And I remember my dad, we didn't live far from my school. And I remember my dad basically, like, pretty much letting us know we no longer had a home. And he said it right when we were driving up and all of our stuff was out on the lawn. And so I was like, okay. I was confused, I was concerned, and furthermore, I was upset with God. Like, how could you allow this to happen? That's the first thought that came to my mind. So we lived in a hotel for a little while. Then finally we moved into a smaller house, townhouse. And I can honestly say that we were poor. I never wanted to admit that, but we were poor. And my parents would always, we still ended up going to church. That never changed. And my parents would always talk about what God was going to do for us, right? He was going to bless us in so many ways. And so, mind you, I've gone through an eviction on top of the personal things that I had to deal with, like the bullying at school. Like, I went through it at school. So I was going to do a video about it. I always say all the time, if your kids are not doing good in school and if they're telling you they're not doing okay in school, listen to them. But that's another video for another day. And I remember starting, that planted a seed when we got evicted the first time. That planted a seed in me because I had so many questions, especially when my father was telling us that God was going to do so many great things for us. And so I remember thinking to myself, like, that's when I started to know, I knew that something was off. That was like the first time I started to notice that something was wrong. And that was also around the time that I got introduced to the prophetic. Never knew anything about the prophetic. Got introduced when I was 13 years old. And, you know, we had prophets come and prophesy to us, telling us that we were going to have a house, like we were going to get a house. And so when they said it and my father said it, I believed it. But then we got evicted again. I was in the 9th grade. We got evicted again. I don't remember coming home to that one. I just remember us going to a hotel, and that's when we found out, like, we got evicted. And that's when the seed that was already planted began to grow. And I was like, something is wrong. So I started to think to myself, God doesn't like my family. God doesn't care about us. We're faithful. We go to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, Bible study, choir rehearsal. We in church all week. We pray. We do all of this stuff. Listen to gospel music. What is wrong? Now, to be very clear, that does not mean that you are saved. But at that time, being a child or a teenager, I didn't know any better. And so I was so concerned. I said, God, what is this? Like, what's going on? And so although I was in church, I really had this thought, and it was depressing. I had this thought that God didn't like my family. He didn't like us. He didn't care about us. That was a thought that I had on a consistent basis. And I remember saying to myself, I couldn't wait until I turned 18 years old, because after I turned 18, I wasn't going back to church. I just remember thinking, like, I'm not going back to church. Why would I serve a God that don't even like my family? You don't even like us. Why would I go to church? Why would I serve you? Like, that doesn't make any sense. I've watched my parents do it for years. So all along the while, I was blaming God and not even knowing that there was more to the story. So we ended up moving to the projects. Never thought that we would ever be in that place, but we did. We ended up moving to the projects, and things got worse. They got so much worse. So graduated from high school. At that point, I was kind of still in church because we had a new young adults leader or whatever. So that's when I really, and I believe honestly, although they weren't perfect, if it wasn't for God sending them, my life probably would have been completely different. And so, being originally from Connecticut, I made the decision after high school to move. I wanted to move back home. I hated the city that I was living in. I hated it because of the trauma that I had to experience. I hated it. And so I said to myself, I'm moving back home. And I always felt like, at the time, I felt like, and I wasn't 100% sure that I heard God's voice. I was only like maybe 40% sure, if that. And I remember sensing that the Lord wanted me to move. Like, he was like, this has to happen. I need you to get away from your parents. And I remember making the decision in 2020. I made the decision right after high school. I made the decision to move. I was like, I'm out. I'm blowing this popsicle stand. I'm going back to Connecticut. My grandmother had passed away. We hadn't been home in a long time. And that was when I knew that I was moving. I knew it. I knew I was moving. Moved to Connecticut. My relationship with God was rocky. It was on the rocks. On top of the fact that church up north is different than church in the South. I'll keep it at that. It's very different. It's so funny. People talk about the South being the Bible Belt, but in my opinion, church up north is a lot more religious than it is in the South, like old school religious, right? And the church that my grandfather went to was a Methodist church. I had never been under, I was non-denomination, going from non-denom to Methodist. And I just was never getting anything out of it. And I remember telling the Lord, I said, if you don't find me a church, I'm done. Like, you gonna have to find me a church. Y'all, a week later, he found me a church, okay? And I missed that church. But anyways, that's when I started building my relationship with God. I got introduced to the prophetic. I received my gift of tongues. I started building my own relationship with God during that time. And I remember a couple of incidences where I was being spiritually abused still by my parents. That was around the time when God began to deal with me. And I always would hear God say, it's not me. It's not me. It's not me. It's not me. Like, he would always say, it's not me. Although all of that happened, me and my mom were like this. Living in Connecticut, I talk to my mom 3 or 4 times a day. She would be at work and I'm calling, you know what I'm saying? Like 3 or 4 times a day. Me and my mom had a very close-knit relationship. I would even say things to the effect of, if my mom would ever die, if my mom were to die today, y'all were gonna have to bury me with her. Like, I'm going to stay with my mom. Like, I'm gonna die with my mom. And I always hung on to everything my mother would say to me, to the point to where I even thought about it this morning. I'm gonna tell you what brought me to telling my story in a second. But it was even so bad to the point to where I used to have thoughts and say to myself, like, my mom knows everything. My mom is never wrong. Everything that she says is right. Like, it's right, it's right, it's right. The Bible says you cannot serve 2 masters, and God said he is a jealous God. And he will have no other gods, idols, before him. And So in 2020, whoa, that's today. In 2015, I heard God tell me it was time for me to move. I had to go back to the city from which I came. And the story was that, the thought was that my parents, that God was going to bless my parents and we were going to finally get the house that we had been holding on to, that the prophetic word that we were holding on to, and that it was going to be all of us coming together to receive the blessing of the Lord. That was the assumption that I was under. And I remember when God was already dealing with me about moving back. But I remember even during that time, my parents made a comment about how this is a part of God's divine plan. But it wasn't a part of God's divine plan concerning them. Moved back, and at this point, I had been in Connecticut for 6 years, and my eyes were completely opened. I was not the same person that moved away. I wasn't the 20-year-old that moved away. I am a different person. And I remember God showing me things. He was like, you see that? You see that? You see that? You notice that? You see that? And how they were living, how my family was living during that time pushed me in a space where I didn't stay there long, y'all. I literally was there for maybe 2 months. And I was like, I gotta go. I can't do this. And I left. I ended up moving in with a friend during that time. But this is what got me. Having conversations with my siblings, because with me being the oldest, I wasn't as close as I would have liked to have been. But I remember having conversations with my siblings and my siblings making the statement saying, God doesn't like our family. And y'all, it was a gut punch because I thought I was the only one that thought that way. And to find out that all of my siblings felt the same way broke my heart. And there was another eviction. I was not a part of that. I had moved away. I was in Connecticut. I didn't learn about it, but I was away. But I saw how it really affected my siblings, because at this point, that's eviction number 3. And so I won't fill in the blanks. You can do the so yourself. So you can only imagine how they were living during that time. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, this is not okay. This is not right. How come, what's going on? And that was when the separating from my parents started. I remember my eyes being opened and God separated me. He separated me from my parents. I'm talking about, I went from talking to my mom 3 or 4 times a day before I moved from Connecticut to, I would go months without speaking to my mom. And I always felt guilty from a sense of that's your mom, and, she may not have long to live, or, she might die tomorrow. So, and I prayed that God would restore our relationship. This is 2015. Again, this is 2015. And during that time, God started to give me dreams, more and more dreams about my parents, and just things that I saw in this, things that God would just reveal to me. He just kept giving me dreams, and I never forgot those dreams. But again, the relationship with me and my parents just kind of started to change. It wasn't the same anymore. Me and my dad were actually building, because we didn't have the best relationship growing up. But if you had told me, again, 10, 15 years ago, that me and my mother were not going to be as close as we used to be, I would have looked at you and I would have laughed. But the reality is that's how it ended. We did not have a close relationship over time. I want to say it started to go downhill very quickly. And I think it was because, one, I'm an adult now, and not only that, I've been away. Granted, I would come back and visit, but I've been away for a long time, and I started building my own relationship with God, and God began to deal with me himself. And I never forget it. This guy came to the church that we were at, and he confirmed everything as it pertains to you can't always listen to your parents. You gotta listen to God. Yeah. And so there were times, y'all, where my mother would give me a word, and I would hang on to that word thinking that it was God. And mind you, because I've learned God's voice for myself and I've built a relationship with myself, my mom would be in one ear and God would be in the other ear. And I think that's why I know that's why God separated us, because I would listen to her and not listen to him. And I learned very quickly I had to put boundaries, even as it pertains to me not sharing things with my mother. God told me, he said, you're not going to be able to share things with your mom anymore. You are going to have to be very careful with what you share with her. And I didn't quite understand. I knew a little bit as to why, but I didn't 100% understand why. But over time, it began to be revealed. I was like, oh yeah, I can't really talk to you about much. And but this is where the manipulation and the spiritual abuse would come in, because my mom noticed that I was no longer talking to her about certain things. And she would make comments like, we used to talk about everything. What happened? Why don't we talk anymore? And she got me one time with that. She got me one time. Y'all, quick. After that, the Lord was like, absolutely not. Something happened. And that's when I was like, nah, I really can't talk to you about this. And so the relationship changed. Things changed completely. Things changed. I started to see, so as I separated myself, I started to see things even the more. And you know how sometimes, I can't speak for everybody else, but sometimes, especially if you were raised as the way I was raised, you would see it, but you would kind of like push it to the side and be like, well, that's just mom. Well, that's just dad. And God got on to me earlier this week. He was like, Michael, you have to forgive yourself and actually repent. And I was like, well, what did I do? And he was like, because you saw the entire time. You saw what your parents were doing the entire time, but you would push it to the side because your response was, well, that's just my parents. Y'all, my parents were still trying to use the whole children obey your parents scripture just to have us to comply. And I just remember, I want to say, after I moved back south, I remember thinking to myself, like, something is wrong. Something's not right. Something is wrong. Like, God had begun to deal with me. I began to learn about God's love, and I began to learn about who he was. And not to say that God wouldn't have us go through seasons of toughness and roughness. But every time my parents, or my father specifically, would say things like, this is our Joseph season. Like, Joseph, he had to go through the potter. And I was like, maybe, but something is wrong. Like, it almost as if like he would try to force that and say that to us to try to make it almost kind of like to deter the questions, because we had questions like something's not right. And it was like at the right time, my parents would say things to almost kind of make us like, well, yeah, but what that would do is it would make us look at God like, well, what are you doing? You get what I'm saying? And that's what they did our entire lives. And I was just like, but because I had stepped out of that, I was like, no, something's wrong. And God had been telling me, he was like, they're hiding something from you. They're hiding something from you. They're hiding. So, y'all know, like, I had questions. I said, well, as a kids, like, is somebody not my father's? Is somebody not my mom's? Like, what is it? And the Lord was like, no, that's not what it is. And I'm like, okay, so what is it? He was like, when you find out, it's going to shock you. When you find out, he said, it's going to shock you. I said, all right. I mean, I asked for years, like, God, what is it? Because y'all, at this point, and this is when I learned, like, no, that might not be God. And don't get me wrong, seasons happen, things happen. We get that. But I started to see what God was doing in my life. To be in my siblings' life, to see the evictions that we had to go through. I, 2, the rest of my siblings, 3. To be a homeowner, a business owner, cars, to see the rest of my siblings, great jobs. They not homeowners just yet, but able to keep their apartments. Part of it was survival mode. We did whatever we needed to do because we didn't want to end up like our parents. God always assured us that we were never going to be like our parents. And so at some point we had to get to a point where we were like, okay, God, we trust you. Well, I did. I can't speak for everybody else. And so things just got worse and worse and worse. So finally 2020 hits. And I kept seeing like little stuff. I kept hearing the gossip my mom was having about me. I kept hearing my mom talking about me. Like God was showing me things about my mom being jealous of me. And I was like, but for what? That just doesn't make any sense to me. And even some of the things that I've had to even kind of talk through in counseling, like, you know, a lot of my low self-esteem that I dealt with as a kid came from my mom. Like I saw a video where this woman was like, many of us don't even realize, but we are usually our daughter's first bully. And I felt that so strongly. Like, it was just so much that I noticed that just wasn't right. You know what I'm saying? And like, again, this is no shade to my mom, but I just noticed that I knew something was wrong. Like, and I knew that there was a way of living that was right. And there was a way of living that was wrong. And I knew it was wrong, but it was almost like there were pieces to the puzzle that I still didn't have. So finally in 2020, the Lord said to me and my sister, hey, y'all need to start counseling. All of my siblings was ready to go to counseling. All of us wanted to go to counseling. They didn't have to worry about paying for anything. We were going to do it because that was the first thing they said. Well, we don't have the money. And I told them, I was like, no, like we got it. Don't worry about it. Y'all, when I tell you my parents fought that thing tooth and nail. Like, how is it all 8 of your children wants to go to counseling, but now only 2 wants to go? Y'all, for years, like when I say for years, 2020 we tried, failed. 2021 tried, failed. 2022 tried, failed. At this point, it was time for me to move. I had moved to Atlanta. So I was like, we were about to give up until got to Atlanta. The Lord was like, no, we need to go through counseling. And when I tell y'all, like, what's crazy is my father knew that we needed to go to counseling, but it was my mom that was going through each of the siblings and also using my father to make sure that we never saw counseling. We never got to counseling. And so needless to say, we didn't do counseling right away. So finally, last year, 2024, the Lord said, I need you to go to counseling. I was like, God, how is this going to work? Like, travel-wise, like, how is this going to work? So I ended up having a conversation with my mom, and I told her, I said, hey, God said we have to go to counseling. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We are going to counseling. So we started going to counseling. There's a Black mama stigma that everybody knows. Black mamas act up during counseling. And when I tell y'all, my mama acted a fool. I have never in my life seen my mama. No, let me stop lying. I have, but I ain't never seen her act like that when it came to us. Counseling was I don't want to say it was a fail. It was what I expected it to be, but worse. It took for me and my sister to step up and be like, nah, none of that is true. Like, my mom tried to hide what was going on. And because my mom and my dad are both in their 60s, well, my dad might be 60 now. Well, yeah, he's about to be 60. But my mom is in her 60s. I expected the response, I wasn't expecting how she responded, but I expected the response. But immediately I knew that my parents thought that the counseling was supposed to be so that we can take out our grievances towards them, but that was not the case. The counseling session was for everybody. And so the Lord had to tell me, he was like, hey, it's not as bad as you think it is. Like, just wait. Second time around, gloves came off. It did not go well. It didn't go well at all. It was so bad to where I was getting ready to walk out the room because my mom lied. Like, that's all she kept trying to hide it. And my father was no better. He wasn't lying, but he knew that what we were saying was truthful. And also my father thought that because he took it better the first time, but he thought that he was expecting us to open up in the beginning, and we were like right away. He was like, let's talk about this now. And it's like, nah, this has been 30 years of trauma. We gotta work our way through that. You get what I'm saying? And we also know, unfortunately, my mom wasn't with it. And so it would have been different if we had private conversations with my dad, but that wasn't the case anymore. Like, at one point we used to be able to talk to my dad one-on-one, but that wasn't the case anymore. I'll keep it at that. So my mother sent a text message and made it very clear she was not coming back to counseling. And I remember hearing the Lord say that he was not pleased. He was actually very upset. And I thought, hoping that my father would still continue the counseling sessions. Y'all made every excuse to say that y'all wasn't going to counseling, and my dad, and you can't say it's because you don't have a ride. You can't say it's because you don't have the money, because we're paying for it. And we thought my dad was going to continue the counseling sessions, but because my mother said no, he stopped going. But we continued it. We continued the counseling sessions. And so that was a lot, having to, travel and, do counseling, but we did what God told us to do. And last year, it just got worse. It got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And I believe that was the time that the Lord wanted to give my parents one more chance, because I had started to have the thoughts of cutting my parents off in 2020. Started having the conversations again with God. 2022, the Lord was like, not yet. Anytime God tells me not yet, that means it's coming. But I'm trying to give them time, not yet. Completely forgetting that God told me in 2023 that I was going to have to separate myself. This was the last straw for me. Thanksgiving was the last straw. I won't go into the whole details of that. God was just opening my eyes to so much. But it was December 30th, the week before New Year's, the week of New Year's. The Lord told me to call some things out within my parents, and child, I'm pretty sure no parents likes to be corrected. I wasn't rude or anything, but that didn't go well at all. But this is what got me. I knew that my parents were speaking against my ministry. I knew that my parents were watching my social media page, and it was a lot, like a lot of monitoring. It was a lot. And a close family member, I'll say that, kept popping up in my spirit. And the Lord was like, you're going to receive your clarity about everything concerning your parents. Have a conversation with this family member. And y'all, how about this? We had a conversation, but it wasn't a conversation. Like, I called, and everything that I had sensed, or God was showing me, that my parents were dragging my name for no reason. That's the crazy part, for no reason. I remember calling this family member, which anytime we would talk, it was always, hey, And when I called this time, it wasn't like that. The Lord was like, just sit back and listen. I cut the phone call very short. And I sat back and I said, God, you showed me this in a dream, that my parents were just dragging my name and I didn't do anything wrong. And the Lord said, I have given them enough time. Go ahead and disconnect. Y'all, I had to block phone numbers. I had to block on social media. I had to block. And I knew I heard God. That was never the question. But I believe that the Lord wanted to give me clarity. And I'm going to read the scripture that he brought me to. It was Matthew chapter 10. He brought me randomly one day. I was reading my word and I said, God, what do you want me to read today? He said, go read Matthew chapter 10 and read the entire thing. So I'm about to read this to you guys. Matthew chapter 10, verses 35, it says, I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies will be right in your own household. If you love your father or mother more than you love me, you are not worthy of being mine. Or if you love your son and daughter more than you love me, you are not worthy of being mine. And he brought me a couple of other scriptures, but again, just for the sake of protecting, I don't want to put everything out. And that settled it for me. As soon as I made the decision and was obedient to God, when I say the next day, the very next day, because the pieces to the puzzle still wasn't there. Like, God, they're hiding something. What is it? The very next day. The very next day. The peace that I had been waiting on and looking for over 20 years, God revealed it to me. Again, I can't share this. Like, I can't share it. To be clear, nobody's gay. Nobody fell into adultery. Nobody is not anything like that. Well, at this point, I don't know. But as of right now, I don't think that's what it is. What God revealed to me shook my foundation to its core. It shook my foundation to its core. And I'm grateful to God that I have built my own relationship with God. Because if I did not, and if I was not secure in God, I don't think I would have been able to stay where I'm at today. I'm 35. For 35 years, the lies. I just could not believe. I could not believe. I take that back. I could believe it, but I was so disappointed. It shook my core. Like, when I say my foundation as a believer was shooken, and if I did not have the relationship that I have with God today, if I did not build my own relationship and learned God on my own, that would have probably completely destroyed me. I couldn't believe what I heard. I could not believe what I saw. It was like the blinders were completely off. They were off. And for years, I asked God about that dream. And I went to people that I know, dream interpretation to the max. Like, I'm telling you, they got the gift of it and they could never interpret my dream. Like, never interpret. And I'm talking about I know I've given these same people different dreams, but this dream, I could never put two and two together. That was the piece to my puzzle. And that's also when I saw that dream manifest in this day. God gave me that dream at 7 years old. I'm 35. I couldn't believe it. I got to figure out where to go from here. Because it's got me shook again. And the Lord said to me, I need you to let them go now. I'm going to restore, but I'm going to say this to you. They will not be in your wedding. As a woman who desires marriage, to hear that come out of God's mouth, I could not believe my ears that it was just that bad. And I remember the Lord saying to me, this was months ago, and I see what he means now. He said, it's a lot worse than what I'm revealing to you. It's actually a lot worse. Y'all, it was so bad to where I had to disconnect from my siblings, because unfortunately God had been trying to open up all of our eyes, and only me and one other sibling took heed. And we've been on the fight, on the run ever since. I had to disconnect from aunts, uncles, cousins. I had to completely disconnect because it was just that bad. And one thing I learned, one thing I know about the enemy, and this is what I've even just learned in, just being in ministry, when he's exposed, he's going to make your life a living hell if he can. And that's exactly what happened. I did confront my parents, and the Lord told me to confront, but he also told me it wasn't going to go over well. And it did not. They still lied. It was just like this whole thing. And I now have to move on with my life until God tells me until God says to reconnect. And the Lord was like, and at this point, y'all, I don't even know when that's going to be. Like, God, like the fact that he said, the fact that he said that my parents were not going to be at my wedding, I don't know when that's going to be. I'm probably not going to have a traditional wedding, but to be honest, that's probably for the best. So it made perfect sense when God said that he was disconnecting me from my family. I was so distraught in 2023, but child, I understood now. It breaks my heart that my siblings, unfortunately, their eyes are still blinded and I had to disconnect from them. It really breaks my heart. And you're probably like wondering, well, why did you have to disconnect from your siblings? If I tell you why I had to disconnect from them, that I would have to tell you the part that God told me not to share. So I cannot say that. I cannot say as to why, but I had to. Now, to be clear, again, I prepared myself for this as much as I possibly could. I just don't think I was expecting the answer that God gave me. I don't think I was expecting that. And so having to walk through counseling because of spiritual abuse, having to really allow God to revamp everything. You know what I'm saying? Like I have to like the foundation of the Lord was like, your foundation is cracked. It's not destroyed, but if there's a crack in your foundation, could you imagine again, growing up, knowing something completely different? Like the Lord was like, you're going to have to unlearn a lot. And luckily God had already started the unlearning process. Thank God. So I was prepared for the most part. I was prepared, but I just wasn't, I was prepared enough. It's just still, it was very much a shock. And he told me I was going to be shocked. I was shocked. Honestly, y'all, I'm actually doing okay. I mean, there are moments where I get real mad, but for the most part, I know that I'm going to be okay. And I know that God has me. And I know that I'm doing the will of the Father. I am doing the will of God. And although it has been challenging as it pertains to I've had to walk through deliverance. It was a lot. And although I've had to walk through deliverance, multiple times, 70 times 7, right? Like I've had to consistently forgive my mom and actually had to deal with it because there was moments that I didn't deal with it. God began to deal with me, was like, hey, you don't have to be strong here. And I was like, I wasn't trying to be. I just don't know how to process this. because this was, if you had told me this like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I never would have thought it was going to end up like this. Even when I started to have the thoughts of disconnecting from my parents, I didn't think it was going to end up like this. And so what brought me to tell my story was this morning during 5 a.m. prayer. As I was praying, I sensed that multiple women that were on prayer, that were on prayer this morning, was dealing with a lot of manipulation by way of their moms, spiritual abuse by way of their moms blocking things in the spirit. And so a lot of which they were all saying, like, I've been thinking about disconnecting. And it's not that God wants to break up homes, but y'all, like, the Bible is very clear about cleaving. And if, you know, especially if we get into the conversation of marriage, if God is calling you to cleave to your spouse, you're going to have to cleave you're going to have to disconnect anyways. But God is doing something new. And yeah, December 30th, 2025, I had to make the decision to disconnect from my parents, my family over time, but specifically my parents. And so this may not, I'm telling this story today because this may not be for everybody, and how you disconnect from your parents may not be how I disconnected. But I will say this, if God is calling you to disconnect, be obedient. Y'all, my obedience opened up my eyes in a way that I just would have, if I wasn't obedient, I would have gone down a very dark, deep path. And so, yeah, I had to disconnect from my parents, my family. And I believe that God is going to restore, but as of right now, I got to follow what God is saying to me. Even if it's unpopular, even if my parents are losing their mind because they no longer have control. But I had to be obedient unto God. And I pray that if you are watching this and you are one that God has been dealing with you about disconnecting, I pray that you become obedient. This was not a video to bash my parents. This was a video to really share the importance of being obedient, because people will try to tell you, well, that's your mom and that's your dad and this. I know that, and I'm well aware of that. But this is what God said. And I could no longer not be obedient. I could no longer take a step back while there was so much going on in the background. And like I said, being an adult and still being spiritually abused by your parents, like what, you know? And like I said, there's so many stories that I could tell, but, you know, again, for protection purposes. And I knew I remember when God started to disconnect me from my mom back in 2015. My mom was a big influence in my life. But because there was a piece to that puzzle that I was unprivy to, I knew something was wrong. But because there was a big piece of my life, or a big piece of the puzzle that I was not privy to, if I was not obedient, I would have walked down, again, a very dark path. And as a prophet, there was no way I was going to be able to, be disobedient to God and walk fully in my call. Like, when I tell you that your decision, if God is calling you to separate from your parents, your decision is not even fully about you. Your decision can affect the bloodline that comes after you. I was telling the ladies this morning, I said, the enemy doesn't want us married. He wants us to continue the cycle of divorce, or continue the cycle of toxic marriages or toxic relationship, or even worse, not get married at all. Not see the seed and the generation that is supposed to come after you. And so sometimes you have to save your own. Sometimes God is going to open up the door for you to save your own life, to save your own destiny. And I chose to pick up my mat and follow God. even if that means walking away from everything that I was taught as a child or as a kid or as a young adult. So that is my story. I pray that this does help somebody. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on TikTok at I am Michael Renee. And I will see you guys on my next YouTube video. Bye.